She was a black woman, standing in a room that didn't want her there. 18 hours on her feet. A hospital that couldn't afford new equipment. A life spent being the last person anyone called, until she was the only person left to call. The most powerful Korean mafia boss in Chicago was dying. His dragon tattoo, black ink crawling up his neck like a warning, was the only thing still bold in a body that was fading fast. 3 of his own surgeons had tried. 3 of his own surgeons had failed. And now he was running out of time in a room full of men who had built their entire lives around never needing anyone they hadn't chosen. But someone had chosen her. She walked in with a hospital tote bag and 18 hours of exhaustion on her face, and not a single person in that room believed she could do what the others couldn't. They looked at her the way she had been looked at her entire life, like the answer couldn't possibly look like her. One of the surgeons spoke. She didn't need a translation. She had heard that tone before. In hospital hallways, in boardrooms, in operating theaters where her presence was tolerated before it was ever respected. She didn't respond. She put on her gloves, picked up the ultrasound, and found in 40 seconds what 3 surgeons had missed entirely. What happened next silenced every single person in that room. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a member and help our channel. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in rooms where someone is dying. Not the silence of an empty house, or the silence of a library, or even the silence of a church before the sermon begins. This is a different kind, heavier, more deliberate. The kind of silence that has weight and edges, the kind you can feel pressing against your chest if you stand still long enough to notice it. That was the silence inside the room when Reese Caldwell walked in. She had been awake for 18 hours. Her feet remembered every one of them. The drive had been 40 minutes of darkness, and the kind of politeness that men with weapons use when they want something from you. The door held open, the seat offered, the word, please, placed at the end of a sentence that was never actually a request. She had watched Chicago move past the tinted windows, the city she had grown up in, the city she had stayed in when every hospital with a better budget had offered her a reason to leave. And she had thought, with the particular clarity that exhaustion sometimes brings, that she had never once imagined her night ending like this. The room was not what she expected. She had built a version of it in her mind during the drive. Something dim, improvised, desperate. What she found instead was equipment she recognized, lighting she had worked under before, monitors that beeped with the kind of steady authority that only comes from machines that cost more than most people earn in a year. Someone had built this carefully. Someone had planned for exactly this kind of emergency, long before this emergency arrived. What they had not planned for was failing. 3 men stood in the room when she entered. She clocked them immediately, the way she clocked everything in a surgical environment, cataloging, sorting, assigning weight. 2 of them wore scrubs. The third wore a suit so dark it made the shadows around him look pale. None of them looked at her the way people look at someone they have been waiting for. They looked at her the way people look at something they have been handed against their will, with the particular expression of individuals who have already decided the outcome before the evidence has been considered. She had seen that expression before.
She had been seeing it her entire life, in hallways and boardrooms and operating theaters where her presence was tolerated
before it was accepted. Accepted before it was respected. Respected only when there was no longer any way to deny what she had just done. She had learned, a long time ago, that the expression itself was not the point. The expression was just weather. You dressed for it and moved through it, and you did not let it slow your hands. Her hands were already moving. She crossed the room without waiting for an invitation, without asking for permission, without acknowledging the silence that shifted around her like water displaced by something entering it. She moved to the monitors first, always the monitors first, and she read them the way other people read a sentence, fluidly, completely, without having to decode what she was seeing. The man on the table was Kwon Jae-hyun. She had seen his name in newspapers. Everyone in Chicago had, even the people who claimed they hadn't. He was the kind of man whose name existed in two versions, the one that appeared in business registrations and charitable donations and the occasional photograph at a gala, and the one that passed between people in lower voices, in contexts that no photograph ever captured. She had never had a reason to think about which version was more accurate. She had never had a reason to think about him at all. Now she was looking at him, and the only version that mattered was the one the monitors were describing. A man whose body was engaged in a quiet and losing argument with time. The dragon tattoo on his neck was the first thing anyone would notice. Black ink, detailed, climbing the left side of his throat with the particular permanence of something chosen in a different life. He was pale in the way that people become pale when the body is redirecting everything it has toward the most essential tasks, letting the surface take care of itself. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow but present. She picked up the ultrasound probe. Behind her, one of the men in scrubs said something. She did not speak Korean, but she understood the tone the way you understand weather. Not the words, just the direction the wind was moving. It was not a welcome. She did not turn around. There was a patient in front of her. There was always only the patient in front of her. Everything else was weather. The ultrasound told her everything the other three had apparently decided not to hear. She moved the probe slowly, deliberately, with the patience of someone who understood that speed in this particular moment was not efficiency. It was arrogance. Speed was what you used when you already knew the answer. She did not yet know the answer. She knew the question, and the question was precise. Where exactly was the fragment sitting? At what angle? And what was it touching that it should not be touching? The image built itself on the screen in shades of gray and black, the language of the body speaking in frequencies that most people in the room could not read. She could read it. She had been reading it for 11 years, in hospitals that couldn't afford the newest machines, which meant she had learned to read the older ones better than anyone else, to extract information from images that younger surgeons trained on cleaner equipment would have found inconclusive. Limitation had been her education in ways that no curriculum had ever intended. She found the fragment in 40 seconds. 3 millimeters. The number settled in her mind with a quiet finality, the way a key settles into a lock before you turn it. 3 millimeters between where the fragment was sitting and where it must never reach. 3 millimeters of margin between the decision she was about to make and the outcome that would follow it, for better or worse, with the indifferent permanence that outcomes always carry. She set the probe down and turned around for the first time since entering the room. The man in the dark suit was watching her. She had felt him watching her since she arrived, not with hostility exactly, but with the particular attention of someone running calculations, measuring variables, waiting for data before committing to a conclusion. She recognized that kind of watching. It was more respectful than the other kind, even if it didn't feel like respect yet. The fragment is 3 millimeters from the left ventricle.
She said it simply, without preamble, without softening the edges of the information. Whatever approach was tried before went directly at it. That's why it didn't work. You cannot go directly at it. The man in the suit, she would learn his name was Daniel, though names were secondary to her in rooms like this one, kept his expression neutral. Behind him, the two men in scrubs exchanged a look that she catalogued and set aside. "What can you do?" Daniel asked. "I can go around it," she said. Subxiphoid lateral approach, 16-degree angle of access. I stabilize the fragment before I address the pressure surrounding it. The fragment doesn't move until I decide it moves. The longer of the two silences she had experienced since entering the room arrived then. She let it sit. She had learned that filling silence with reassurance was something people did when they needed to convince themselves as much as the person they were speaking to. She did not need to convince herself. She had already done the geometry in her mind while looking at the ultrasound image, and the geometry was sound. One of the men in scrubs stepped forward. He spoke at length, in Korean, with the cadence and authority of someone accustomed to being the most credentialed person in any given room. She watched his face while he spoke, the set of his jaw, the angle of his shoulders, and understood the shape of what he was saying before Daniel translated it.
He says there is an alternative approach he has not yet attempted. He would prefer to try it before proceeding with something undocumented. She looked at the man in scrubs directly. Not with anger. Anger was weather too, but with a specific quality of attention that she reserved for information that needed to be received accurately. "How long to prepare?" she asked. Daniel relayed the question. The answer came back. 40 minutes. She did not look away from the man in scrubs when she responded. "He has less than 20, she said. "I am not telling you that to apply pressure. I am telling you that because it is what the monitors are currently saying, and the monitors do not have a preference about who performs this procedure." The room absorbed that. She watched it absorb it, watched the small, almost imperceptible shifts that moved through the bodies of the people standing around her, the recalibrations that happen when a fact arrives and cannot be argued with, only accepted or denied. The man in scrubs held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable, then looked away. Not at Daniel, not at the patient, at the floor. It was Daniel who spoke next, quietly, in English, with the finality of someone who had done the calculation and accepted the result. "Proceed." She was already turning back to the table before the word finished leaving his mouth. The instrument tray was to her left. She had already memorized its contents when she walked in. Another habit formed in hospitals where what you needed was not always what you had. So you learned to know immediately what you were working with. Everything she needed was there. More than she had worked with before, in rooms with far less at stake. She thought, briefly, of a night 6 years ago. A 16-year-old boy, a car accident, a sliver of glass in nearly the same position. A hospital where 3 of the 4 monitors were running on backup power, and the lighting in the surgical suite flickered twice during the procedure. She had developed the approach that night not because she was inspired, but because the standard approach was not available to her and the boy needed to live. He had lived. She had never written the technique down. There was no journal that would have published it without years of trials and documentation she didn't have time to produce. It existed only in her hands and in her memory, and in the fact that a 22-year-old man was currently studying architecture in Detroit without knowing how close he had come to never doing anything at all. She thought of him for exactly 1 second. Then she thought of nothing except the work. The overhead light was precise and generous, the best surgical lighting she had worked under in years, And she noted this with the same neutrality with which she noted everything. Not gratitude, not irony, just information. The room was quiet now in a different way than it had been when she entered. The first silence had been the silence of doubt. This one was something else. She positioned her hands. 16 degrees. She had done this once before, in worse conditions, with less. She began. There is a moment in every procedure, every surgeon knows it, though few speak of it directly, where the work stops being technical and becomes something else entirely. Where the training and the knowledge and the years of accumulated precision reach the edge of what they can guarantee, and what remains is something quieter, something that lives below the level of certification and protocol, in the place where a person either trusts themselves completely or they do not. Reese Caldwell reached that moment approximately 11 minutes into the procedure. Her hands did not waver. That was the thing about her that the people watching could not have known from looking at her resume or her credentials, or the name of the hospital where she worked, which was not the name of a hospital that impressed people at the kinds of events where Kwon Jae-hyun's legitimate business interests were discussed. What they could not have known was that her stillness was not the stillness of someone suppressing fear. It was the stillness of someone who had already made peace with the full weight of what she was doing, and had decided, clearly and without drama, to do it anyway. Behind her, no one spoke. This was new. For the first 11 minutes, there had been the occasional murmur, low in Korean, the kind of commentary that people offer when they are watching something they expect to go wrong and want to be on record as having anticipated it. She had registered each instance of it the way you register a sound outside a window at night. Present, noted, categorized as irrelevant to the immediate task, and filed away. But now, there was nothing. She understood why without needing to turn around and confirm it. She had reached the part of the procedure that could not be argued with. The part where the approach she had described was visibly, undeniably working. Where the fragment was responding exactly as she had said it would respond, moving in the direction she had said it would move, cooperating with the geometry she had drawn in her mind before a single instrument had been lifted. There was nothing to murmur about now. There was only watching. She found, distantly, that she did not feel satisfied by this. She had never performed for an audience, and she was not performing now. The silence behind her was not a validation she had been waiting for. It was simply a change in atmospheric conditions. The weather had shifted, and she had noted it, and her hands continued their work with exactly the same quality of attention they had carried from the beginning. The monitor beeped. It had been beeping the entire time, of course, steady, metronomic, the body announcing its own presence in the only language it had available. But this beep was different in frequency, fractionally, in a way that she caught before any of the other people in the room caught it, because she had been listening for it, because listening was as much a part of what she did as seeing or touching. She adjusted. A movement so small it was nearly invisible, a fraction of a degree, a redistribution of pressure so subtle that it would not have appeared in any recording of the moment as a distinct action. It appeared only in what did not happen next. What did not happen next was the complication that the change in frequency had been announcing. It arrived at the threshold and found her already there, already addressing it. And so it did not arrive at all. The monitor steadied. She heard, from somewhere behind her and to the right, the sound of a breath being released. A single breath from a single person that had apparently been held for longer than the person holding it had consciously realized. She did not turn to see who it belonged to. It didn't matter who it belonged to. What mattered was the fragment, and the fragment was almost free. She thought of her mother then. She did not choose to think of her. The thought arrived the way thoughts arrive in moments of extreme focus, unbidden, slipping through the narrow gap between concentration and instinct. Her mother had been 51 years old. She had walked into a hospital on a Tuesday morning with chest pain that she had been ignoring for 3 days because she had learned, across a lifetime of interactions with systems that processed her slowly and reluctantly, that urgency was a quality other people's emergencies were granted more readily than hers. She had waited 4 hours. The physician who eventually saw her was not a bad person. Reese had spent years being certain of this because the alternative, that deliberate indifference had been a factor, was a conclusion that led somewhere she could not afford to go and still function at the level her patients required. The physician was not a bad person. He was an overworked person, operating inside a system that had quietly, consistently, over many years, taught everyone inside it to read certain presentations as less urgent than they were, to give certain patients less immediate weight, to move in certain directions before others, without ever articulating the logic behind the movement. Her mother had died at 4:47 in the afternoon. Reese had been in her 2nd year of residency. She had received the call between patients, in a hallway that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee, and she had stood very still for a long moment, and then she had walked back into the room where her next patient was waiting. Because the patient was waiting, and because standing still in that hallway was not going to change what had already become permanent. She had never told anyone that story in full. She had offered pieces of it, occasionally, to residents who needed to understand why she moved through emergency situations the way she did, why she treated every presentation as worthy of immediate attention, why she did not allow triage to become a quiet negotiation between urgency and assumption. But the full story she kept to herself, not as a wound, but as a compass, something that told her, always, which direction was forward. Forward was always toward the patient. The fragment moved. It came free with the particular quality of release that she had learned to recognize over hundreds of procedures. Not dramatic, not sudden, but clean and complete, like the last piece of something settling into place or the last weight leaving a scale. She secured it. She confirmed its removal with the same ultrasound she had used to find it. The image on the screen showed her what she needed to see. The space that had been occupied was now clear. The monitor's rhythm, which had carried the entire procedure as its underscore, shifted, gradually, measurably, in the direction that monitors shift when the body receives information that the immediate crisis has passed and begins, cautiously, to believe it. She began to close. Her hands moved through the closing with the same quality of attention they had maintained throughout. Not relaxed, not celebratory, not faster now that the most critical moment had passed. Completion was not less important than the work that preceded it. She had seen procedures undone in their final moments by the subtle arrogance of assuming the hardest part was over. The hardest part was never definitively over until the patient was stable and she was no longer in the room. Behind her, someone said something in Korean. She did not need a translation. The tone was the translation. She was washing her hands when Daniel Cho finally spoke. Not immediately after the procedure. There had been a period of controlled activity following the closing, the kind of careful, methodical work that happens after the critical moment has passed, and the room needs to return itself to something resembling order. Monitors checked. Vitals confirmed. Instructions given, clearly and without negotiation, about what the next 72 hours needed to look like if the work she had just done was going to hold.
She had spoken to the room as a whole, because the room as a whole was responsible for what happened next, and she did not have the luxury of choosing which parts of it she trusted. The two men in scrubs had listened. She noted this, not with surprise exactly, but with the particular quality of attention she gave to things that represented a shift from what had come before. They had listened, and they had not looked at the floor while listening. And when she finished, they had asked two questions that were medically sound,
which told her that whatever else they were not without competence. They had simply, tonight, been without the specific competence this specific situation required. She had answered the questions directly and without editorial, because the questions deserved direct answers, and because there was a patient in the room, and the patient was the point. It was only after all of this, after the room had reorganized itself around the new reality of a man who was still alive, that Daniel Cho pushed off from the wall where he had spent the entire procedure and walked to where she was standing at the sink. He didn't say anything immediately. He stood beside her for a moment, looking at the middle distance, with the expression of someone assembling words in the correct order before releasing them. "I knew your name before tonight," he said finally. 3 years ago. My sister. St. Aldrich, Tuesday night in November. She came in after a car accident on the I-90. You were on call. She turned off the water, reached for the towel. "I remember a Tuesday night in November," she said. "I don't remember every name." She remembers yours. She dried her hands with the same methodical attention she gave everything, and she thought about what he had just told her. And she understood then why she had been the name that came up in a room full of people trying to save a man's life. It was not random. It was never random. Someone had known, specifically, what she was capable of, because they had seen it, because she had done it before, in a hospital that no one in this room would ever have sought out by choice, on a Tuesday night in November, with equipment that was adequate and lighting that was sufficient, and the same hands she had been working with her entire career. "Why didn't you tell me that in the car?" she asked. "Because it wasn't relevant to whether you would come," he said. "You would have come either way." She looked at him. He was right, and they both knew he was right. And the fact that he was right said something about her that she had never needed to announce, because it announced itself in every room she had ever worked in, quietly, through the accumulated evidence of what she chose to do and what she refused to leave undone. She folded the towel. "He's going to want to talk to you," Daniel said. "When he wakes up. He's going to want to know who you are. He already knows who I am." "He knows your name," Daniel said. "That's different." She considered this. There was a version of the next conversation, the one that would happen when Kwon Chae-hyun opened his eyes and found her sitting in the chair beside his bed, that she had been constructing in the back of her mind since the procedure ended, in the quiet peripheral space where she processed things that were not yet immediate but would be soon. She had considered what he might say, and what she might say, and what the distance between those two things would feel like to stand inside. She had decided, already, that she would tell him the truth. Not as a confrontation. She was not interested in confrontation, but because the truth was the only currency she had ever found to be reliable. In rooms like this one, and in rooms nothing like this one, with people who had power and people who had none, with people who had always seen her clearly, and people who had needed to be shown. She would tell him the truth, and she would let him do with it whatever a man like him did with truths that arrived in inconvenient forms. That was not her part of the equation. She spent the night in a room that was more comfortable than her apartment, on a bed that cost more than her monthly student loan payment, and she slept for 6 hours
with the particular depth of someone whose body has been waiting a long time for permission to stop. In the morning, she ate food that was brought to her without being asked.
And she drank coffee that was better than the coffee at the hospital. And she thought about the patients she would not see today and sent a message to the hospital that was honest without being specific. When she walked back into the room where Kwon Jae-hyun was lying, he was awake. The monitors beside him showed her everything she needed to know before she reached the bed. The vitals were where she wanted them, moving in the direction she wanted them to move. The body continuing the work she had started, doing what bodies do when the obstacle has been removed and they are given the conditions to recover. She checked each reading with the same attention she would have given them in any hospital room, because the address of the room did not change what the numbers meant. He watched her do this without speaking. When she finished and looked at him, she found an expression on his face that she had not seen there before. Not in the photographs she had encountered in newspapers. Not in the brief looks she had stolen during the procedure when confirming his position. It was not the expression of a man who controlled territories or managed fear or made decisions that other people spent their lives trying to anticipate and accommodate. It was the expression of a man who had been somewhere very far away and had come back, and was still in the process of understanding that he had come back, and was looking at the person responsible for that fact with something that had not yet finished becoming whatever it was going to be. "You saved my life," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, rougher from disuse, and from whatever the body goes through in the hours after a procedure like the one she had performed. It was a statement, not a question, said the way people say things when they are still slightly surprised that the sentence is true. "I did my job," she said. "My doctors could not do their job. They were working with the wrong approach." She said it without satisfaction. "That happens." He was quiet for a moment. The dragon tattoo on his neck moved slowly with his breathing. Steady now, regular, the body keeping its own rhythm. His eyes, dark and still carrying the remnants of what the night had cost him, stayed on her with an attention that she recognized as the attention of a man who had survived for a long time by reading people accurately. She let him read her. She had nothing to obscure. "Why?" he said finally. She knew what he was asking. She answered the question he was actually asking, not the one the words described. "Because my mother walked into a hospital once and the people there decided, without saying so, without even realizing they were deciding, that her situation could wait," she said. "She died that afternoon." She paused, not for effect, but because the sentence required a moment around it. "I decided a long time ago that I would never be the reason someone's family got that phone call. Not for any reason. Not for anyone." Kwon Jae-hyun looked at her for a long time after she finished speaking. Outside the room, Chicago was moving through its morning. The city indifferent and continuous, the way cities are, carrying inside it the hospital where she worked, and the people who would arrive there today, and the wards that needed funding, and the children in the pediatric wing who deserved better equipment than what the budget had provided, and the whole, long, ordinary machinery of a life spent doing the same essential thing, over and over, for people who could pay, and people who could not, and people who would never have extended the same consideration to her. She did not say any of this. She didn't need to. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, the administrator of St. Aldrich Medical Center opened an email notification about a wire transfer that had been received overnight. She read the amount. She read it again. She called the board chair. The board chair called the hospital director. By noon, 3 people had cried in professional settings, which was unusual for all 3 of them. The transfer was anonymous, designated specifically for the pediatric wing. Reese Caldwell heard about it at the end of her shift, standing in the same hallway where she had received a phone call about her mother 11 years ago. Reading the email on the same phone she used to set surgical timers and answer questions from residents, and order the same lunch from the same place 3 times a week because she never had time to find somewhere new. She stood still for a moment. Then she put the phone in the pocket of her white coat and she walked back toward the ward. Because there was a patient waiting, and there was always a patient waiting. And the distance between where she was standing and where she needed to be was exactly the same distance it had always been. She covered it the same way she always did, without hesitation, without looking back. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been the most qualified person in the room and still had to fight just to be heard? Have you ever had to choose between walking away from someone who never respected you and doing what was right anyway, simply because it was right? And when no one was watching, when there was no applause and no recognition waiting on the other side, what did you choose? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, excellence, and quiet justice, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.